Welcome everyone to our ASEAN Forum for 2022. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that the University of Sydney is located on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Our event today is co-hosted by the ASEAN Australia Youth Partnership, and I very much thank them for their involvement. Today's session is divided into three sections. First, we'll hear a little pitch from our five speakers. We'll have a discussion with them, among them in the panel, and then you as the audience will have an opportunity to direct questions at them. Please put your questions in the Q&A function. You won't be able to speak directly to them, but I will just read your questions out and they will engage with them. So welcome again tonight, and welcome to our speakers, Tamerlane Beasley, Huang Letu, Josephine Lavenza, Richard Maud, and Susanna Patton, I forgot your last name. So we're going to start now with the pitches straight in. Each of our speakers will speak to us for 2.5 minutes. So a very short pitch, and then we'll move into the panel discussion. And Huang, we're starting with you.
Thank you, Michelle. Very good to be with you. My pitch is simple. Australia, as a development partner of ASEAN, has limited resources in the great power competition, in the intensifying great power competition where there are more and more actors. So my pitch is Australia needs to partner in the areas that are of mutual growth. And one of them is the technology transformation. And this is not to put Australia as necessarily a donor and the rest of Southeast Asia or ASEAN as a recipient, but to integrate and develop together, because this is a new domain where both Australia and countries in the region are in a very uneven way develop. And this is an area of future, and Australia needs to think several decades ahead to have a more integrated technology environment and development with the region. So this is my pitch. There are a lot of advantages that Australia currently has, including the cybersecurity standards and developing internet standards and critical technology and critical infrastructure, which some countries have in the region and some have less. But it is a very good start to bind that technological environment together in the long run. So this is my short pitch.
Hey, and Richard, I think you're coming second.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Great to be here with you and with such a terrific panel. Well, my pitch would be to say to the new government that while Australia is gripped with major power competition and China and Southeast Asia, that Southeast Asia itself is not. Yes, it does worry about conflict. It doesn't want to be forced, as it says, into invidious choices between the major powers. But Southeast Asia's highest priorities are actually recovering from the pandemic, both in a health sense and in an economic sense. So their growth, their jobs and their inequality. So if we want to have impact in Southeast Asia right now, we have to respond to the region's highest priority, and that's economic growth. And this is a challenge for us because Australia is actually not as well placed as some of the region's other partners to respond to this need. We're not highly integrated into East Asian manufacturing supply chains. We don't build a big infrastructure. Our direct investment in Southeast Asia is extraordinarily low. And trade is sort of healthy enough, but when you look at exports and imports as a percentage of ASEAN's total trade, actually we're quite a small trading partner for Southeast Asia in global terms. Now, this is a problem that's been around for a while. It's not easy to fix. It stems in part from a lack of very strong complementarities in the past between Southeast Asia and Australia in an economic sense. And it also stems in part from the fact that Australian businesses believe that they can make more money with less risk in other parts of the world. But the new government has promised another go around on this. They've commissioned an ASEAN trade strategy. And I think, if I could end on a hopeful note here in my pitch, there are some possible areas of emerging opportunity for Australia and Southeast Asia where we might actually find more complementarity than we have been in the past. And I'll just mention a couple before I'll close out my pitch. So they are Southeast Asia's growing consumer class. So I'm just old enough to remember the day when Australia's economy was roughly the size of all of ASEAN's 10 economies. Now Indonesia is $1 trillion economy with a growing consumer class. Other economies have growing consumer classes as well. So that's one area of opportunity. The dramatic growth of digital trade and e-commerce is another. The focus on Southeast Asian countries on building human capital through education, particularly technical and vocational education, that's another opportunity. And then two more just to finish on. Southeast Asia will continue to have a very strong focus on health security. It doesn't want to be caught out in the next pandemic or next health crisis in the way it was over the last couple of years. And then lastly, helping Southeast Asia through some very significant clean energy transitions is another opportunity. They need policy advice, they need regulatory advice, they need financing, and they need clean energy technology and infrastructure. So that's my pitch. You're on mute, Michelle.
I am. Thank you very much, Richard. And over to you, Susanna.
Thanks, Michelle. So my pitch is that the new government needs to take another look at the role that education plays in Australia's relationships with the region. And that's for two reasons. It's firstly in terms of the people-to-people connections that are built through education, but it's also in terms of what Richard was just speaking about, and that's Australia's contribution to human capacity building and economic growth. So we tend to make an assumption in Australia that education is a real strength for us, but actually if you look at the data in terms of higher education enrolments from Southeast Asia, the numbers are quite flat for many countries. And for those countries where the numbers are rising, like Vietnam, Australia is actually becoming a relatively less important destination as other countries like Japan become more important. Survey data from the Lowy Institute and other polls also shows that in terms of where students would like to go, Australia is becoming less attractive. So what should we do about this? I think one thing is we need to, first of all, reframe our international education strategy much more in terms of relationships and connections and influence, and away from a purely market-based focus. I think secondly, we need to take another look at our scholarship programs. Currently, Australia only has the Australia Awards, which is a development-focused program, but we don't have a merit-based scholarship system that is open to students from all countries, regardless of their level of development, although there are some exceptions to that. And actually, Australia currently has Australia for ASEAN scholarships, which is a way of working around that. But I think we need something much broader scale and much more long-term to encourage top students from Southeast Asia to continue to choose Australia. And finally, I think that accepting that higher education is changing, Australia needs to develop new ways of supporting human capacity building in the region at scale. So whether it's micro-credentials or online learning or supporting officials and emerging leaders to come to Australia and undertake higher education here, I think is really important. But I think we also need to accept that the ways that we build that human capacity are not necessarily going to be the same ways that we build the people-to-people connections and those kind of traditional influence connections. So we need to have a strategy which is able to do more than one thing in terms of education and Australia, Southeast Asia links. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Susanna, and over to you, Josephine.
All right, thank you, Michelle. And it's very interesting because my pitch, because I'm currently sitting in the ASEAN market, I'm based in Jakarta. So I think the point that there are three key areas that I think is very important, because I think nowadays ASEAN sees Australia as a state, as a stabilizer between like the hurdle between China and US. And I think when Australia government wants to like some sort of accelerate the relationship with ASEAN members, it's of course people to people, but concentrate on youth particularly, because I think now ASEAN is currently focused on engaging the youth, because they understand even though on the higher level, it's the policy makers that's gonna be the one, the key decision maker of how the ASEAN would look like. But youth has, at least in Indonesia nowadays, like 50% of the say like what kind of a ASEAN community they would see. And if Australia can tap in on that by not, it doesn't have to be like a very complicated one, but just building a genuine relationship on how you exchange the views on what kind of a relationship that we want to build in the next, let's say, 5 years. So that would be a very interesting point for us to be feel that, oh, we feel engaged as by the Australian government, and it's strengthening a sustainable relationship. So it's a relationship that is not based on whether what can you give or what can we take. So that's one. And second is, of course, as sitting in the digital economy, that would be a very important part. The point where ASEAN is like really, really fast in terms of the startup ecosystems and very close maybe now currently in US, because most of the knowledge exchange, funding, everything was actually echoed by the company based on Silicon Valley. And in Australia, I think they have a lot of things to give to like ASEAN startup community. And if that kind of thing that you just touch one point, making a hub in like Singapore or in Bali, and then you automatically engage all the 10 member states. So I think that's my pitch for the government. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks so much. And Tamerlane, can you bring us home?
Thanks. And I think I agree with what all of the previous speakers have said. So the key thing I think that's really important, aside from what's already been said, is people-to-people relationships. So I think what Australia really has to offer in the region is very much the convening power of bringing people together, and also thinking more broadly than bilateral relationships or just large institutions, but recognising that a lot of the challenges we face in the region and security challenges are not just framed in terms of hard security, but human security. And these are shared issues for us living in this region and being a part of this region. So issues, I mean, just an example this week, foot and mouth disease, these are things that we all need to work on. So climate change, economic development post-COVID, digital transformation, water security, regional security and peace. All of these things are actually issues that equally affect Australia. So what we need to do is bring people together to share experience and collaborate. And I agree with previous speakers that it's not so much a what do you want and what do we have, but it's a collaboration. So I think it's a partnership-based approach, which is so important. And I think there's just some really quick examples of what works, is that it's, again, with that collaboration, it's having projects and initiatives which reflect our new reality. And many of these are emerging anyway. We need to double down on these. So for example, Bukalapak, one of the biggest tech unicorns in Indonesia, has 100 million users, and they've just invested in an R&D facility in Melbourne. So, and that's collaboration for both our mutual interests. I've worked with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Vietnam in terms of gender, peace and security involving women in diplomacy. So their shared interests, how do we share what works for us? What is needed? How do we come together and have dialogue? Gender, peace and security is an area that ASEAN are very interested in, and it's something that Australia has a lot of experience in. So how do we share those experiences? With the Australia-ASEAN Council, the projects that we fund, so for example, the Bridge Educational Exchange, and I think it reflects the fact that digital transformation enables us to engage in different ways, more sustainable ways, and we need to rethink how we continue to collaborate in the region. So the Bridge Exchange, faith-based dialogue programs, and programs for young social entrepreneurs. So really doubling down and leveraging those digital relationships, which we've found have actually flourished in the last couple of years across ASEAN, and continuing to partner and work with the region. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. That's been a really stimulating start to our evening, but of course now we get down to the hard stuff. I'd like to start with an observation that Josephine made about Australia's position as a stabiliser in the region, not the US, not China. Opening to the floor, but perhaps particularly to Richard and Huang as well, We reflect a little on the growing tensions in East Asia and their impact both in Southeast Asia itself and on Australia's relations with Southeast Asia. Richard, do you want to start us off on those?
Yeah, thanks very much, Michelle. Look, an anecdote and then an answer. Evan Laxmana, who's a very sharp young Indonesian analyst, wrote a piece in the Australian Financial Review after the announcement of AUKUS, where he said that AUKUS and the way in which it was announced amounted to ASEAN being made strategically redundant, I think was his word. And what he was pointing to was something that a number of us, including Huang and Susanna, have written on and thought about, which is that over recent years, Australia has acted to balance China's power in the Indo-Pacific with greater determination and greater weight. So we've seen the re-emergence of the Quad. We've seen AUKUS, the alliance has strengthened through force posture initiatives that are seeing more American military presence in Northern Australia. For example, Australia's taken a pretty assertive stance on just about any issue that China's been involved in. And that harder balancing by Australia has been part of sharpening competition between China and America, and Southeast Asia is uncomfortable about that. They don't like it, and the harder we balance, the greater the sense of divergence between Australia and Southeast Asia about the nature of the problem with China and how we should manage it. And we've seen Southeast Asian leaders make the point repeatedly in recent years that they want the major powers to manage their competition responsibly, that they won't be choosing a side, that they're going to stick to strategic autonomy. So there is a bit of a tension between Australian foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific and our objectives in relation to China and our desire to forge independent relations of influence with Southeast Asia. That tension is not fatal, but it does have to be managed carefully. It requires the right narrative, and it requires energy and investment in the bilateral relations, which the current government has promised it will do.
And we'll return to the topic of the current government towards the end. But Pong, would you like to add your reflections on that same question?
Yeah, so when sort of the great power competition made a kind of return or started to be at forefront again of strategic policy debates, I think one could assume that Australia as another middle power would have a closer view with the middle powers in the region, like the ASEAN countries, which is not wanting to be in the middle of that and perceiving the great power competition challenging, for the middle and smaller powers. But Australia, like Richard said, took very clear approach and actually became one of the spade in the debate, and so sort of very clearly aligned with the US, and sometimes even seen from the region like making the debate narrative and even tensions a little bit harder than they could have been. So I think that was a clear sort of difference between a group of middle powers in the region, Southeast Asia, that reject that kind of zero-sum framing, like Richard mentioned, and Australia being a middle power, but took very much different approach. But I also would say, as time progresses, I would say in my view, there is this difference, and we need to recognize that too, that there is a difference in official narrative and official response, which is exactly what Richard said, not being pushed into making choice and preserving what was before this intensifying great power competition, which is a more equalized and globalized order, if that's even really a case. And the private consideration and private thinking that everyone does, but not everyone would share, which they do, where they do recognize that the former order is no longer, and what they are officially putting as a main narrative is a way of preserving as long as possible, I would say, the status quo and delaying any hard choices as much as possible, with a hope that the great power themselves will arrive at some predictable formula of relationship that could stabilize and then would make the life of middle and smaller powers a little bit less complicated. I think that's the general take I would have.
Thanks. And Josephine, seeing it was your point, I'd like to return to you and give you an opportunity to add, contradict, reflect on what's been said.
All right. I think I agree with like what Richard and Huang mentioned about that. I mean, like ASEAN wants Australia to like see them as an autonomous region that no matter like what side it is, because like I think not that we in Southeast Asia not care about the conflict in China, or we just don't want to pick side, because we believe that it's just we want to be really strategic, and it's just like it's ASEAN members, like it consists of 10 member countries, and we just want to like at least be on the same safe haven. And so think why stabilizer, because we believe that in the middle of that kind of a power competition, we always see that Australia is some sort of a cool breeze. So if they can some sort of give that kind of at least convictions to the ASEAN members, that I think that would really strengthen the relationship. Like what I mentioned, it's not about what you can give and what you can take, but it's mostly how do we shape the future together for both regions in the next like 5 years. So I think that's how I some sort of construct my point on that.
It's a tricky question, isn't it? I suspect it's only going to get trickier over the next couple of years. I'd like to turn now to an observation that Tamerlane made, which was that although we've got these really big challenges in hard security, there's also a lot of issues around human security and shared problems. Borders don't mean anything in the face of COVID, as we've all learnt. Other things like foot and mouth, monkeypox, you name it. We're in an era where pathogens seem to be looming large. And of course, that's not the only issue. But thinking about COVID and the post-COVID world, Tamerlane, could you reflect a little on what you think the pandemic has done to Southeast Asia and its internal relations, but also its relationship with Australia?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the pandemic has accelerated some things. And one of the things that we've seen is that it's accelerated digital transformation. And like even just as simple as working from home in Jakarta, like working with people in Jakarta who've had 30 hours a week liberated from their lives because they don't have to be commuting. And there is a commitment to doing things differently that I don't think would have happened to the same extent if we hadn't been through COVID. And I think this digital transformation is reshaping the way we continue to engage. And I think we can't go back. And so that concept of, well, you know, we flip back to what it was, and even our educational models and educational exchange, I don't think we can go back to some of our former plans around, for example, how do we support Indonesian language education? The challenge is Australia has left some of these things for so long that we don't have even a pipeline of teachers, even if we wanted to engage and flick the switch and say, okay, let's have lots of people studying Bahasa. It's not possible. But what we've seen, interestingly, and in my business, which is a business that does advisory and training, is our business almost doubled in the last year because all of a sudden we're able to work in more engaged, longer term ways with people rather than having to be face-to-face for an individual event, which is a very high expense thing. So, for example, going back to the Indonesian language example, is that the Bridge program is a classic example of people-to-people exchange where we bring together classrooms in Australia and Indonesia, and you have children in Indonesia practicing their English, you have children in Australia practicing their Bahasa, you do teacher exchange, you build relationships, you build partnerships, you build cultural capability and understanding all at once. So I think this increasing sophistication rather than learning about the region, and I think finally we're starting to shift beyond some of that old narrative that it's like Australia and ASEAN as separate and we need to learn about Asia. And I think our new foreign minister just embodies this is she is of the region, as are 1 million Australians have Southeast Asian cultural heritage, and highlights how much this is part of our future, it's part of our present, and it's being more sophisticated about our future. So I think the dial has shifted, and we need to lean into this new digital landscape where we can maintain relationships and do things differently. We can accelerate them, we can leverage those relationships and partner in a more sophisticated way.
I'd like to pick up on two themes that you've raised, which emerged in the pictures before. One is about digital transformation, and we'll come back to that. But before we do, Susanna, I'd like to draw you on this question. You were talking about new models of education and particularly focused on Southeast Asians gaining skills or education from Australia. Reflecting on the post-COVID context and the digital tools we now have in education, is that part of the picture for you, or what particular things would you think would come out in this period?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a couple of points on that. One is, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think we do need to be, conscious of preserving face-to-face, like in-person engagement, and having students come to Australia and have their studies here as that sort of primary and kind of traditional way of, I suppose, really having that kind of long-term influence and people-to-people relations, which is what people, I think, associate with Australian education. To me, that remains very important and traditional. But I also think that Australia has an opportunity to be really responsive to regional demands for human capacity building, maybe in a way that some other partner countries to Southeast Asia aren't. Because I think we can offer things like, for example, a mix of online and in-person training for, say, mid-level officials that could be, really relevant to what they need. And so that's where I think Australia should be taking a really kind of targeted and opportunistic approach, and be really proactive in looking for those opportunities, whether it's in energy or economics or health. I don't personally have a strong view about what those thematic areas should be, but I think that's the kind of mentality that we need to have about being very responsive to regional priorities, and I think that's our advantage as well.
I mean, an interesting aspect of digital technology in the sense that Tamerlane was talking about is the extended opportunity to engage and the democratization of the opportunity to engage in many ways. And I mean, of course, this existed before COVID, but the pandemic has really raised this. So, for example, I was doing some work on trade union networks during the pandemic, and we did all the field work virtually. And that meant I didn't actually just speak to national figures. I could speak to people in small villages around the region. So it's really interesting, I think, from a researcher's perspective, but also from that people-to-people perspective and sort of more structured aspects of our engagement, the opportunities of the combination of face-to-face and digital engagement bring, especially now that so many more people, both in Australia and in Southeast Asia, are comfortable with technologies like Zoom. And see them, I was just on a call to Timor before this meeting, and we can Zoom to Timor now. That would just not have been possible a few years ago. So it's really interesting to reflect on the opportunities that generates. But the other aspect of the digital world is, of course, the digital economy. And both Richard and Josephine alluded to this in their remarks. So Josephine, I'd just like to push you a little further on what opportunities you see within the digital economy for Australia's engagement with Southeast Asia.
All right. So I think because now that I'm also sitting in the some sort of an edtech space, which is the education technology, it's very interesting that looking at the tech landscape in Southeast Asia is growing, I think 10 times before the pandemic, because now that everyone is really want to be immersed themselves in the digital economy. And I think the opportunity is like besides the capital, of course, because I think now that the emerging startups in Southeast Asia, it can like you can find like 1,000 startups every month, new startups. But the thing is like what Australia can really bring to the ASEAN is like how you help ASEAN like having more tech talent. Because I think beyond the funding, beyond the capital investment, that kind of a human capital structure at this point, it's very interesting because now that we have a lot of ideas, you have like a lot of business incubators, but the talent for the tech itself is very, very short. So I think that one thing, and also the other thing is like, for example, that maybe about of educations that I find interesting is like how Australia can not only help the students in the digital economy, but also help the teachers to like engage. Because I think most of the problems that happen in ASEAN is now that everyone use Zoom, everyone go to schools with Zoom, but the problem is like there is no engagement. So that kind of decrease the attainment rate of the quality of the graduates. So I think that kind of two space that mostly I think most on the human capital improvement in that sense. So that's how I see it.
Richard, I'll come to you on this same question, but before I do, of course, the digital economy has also created a democratization in gender terms. If we think about women's access to business, and this isn't just in ASEAN, in Australia, the mumpreneurs, I hate that term, but it is a thing. And thinking about how women might engage in business, in civil society, in all sorts of realms. And Tamerlane, I know you have some thoughts on this. Would you like to share them?
Yeah, we've just found it's interesting, even projects that we fund through the Australia ASEAN Council with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, for example, a Muslim exchange program, we've shifted that to be online to maintain the relationships and continue the program. And because the program is now just not a period only of being in country, what it's enabled is those relationships to be over a longer period. And so they've gradually drip fed and grown in a very sustained way. But also we found a lot more women are able to participate in the program who have caring responsibilities, because you may be able to log on to a session with a small group of people, and it needs to be relationship focused. It's not just broadcast. But if you have children and caring responsibilities, that's much more accessible than coming to Australia for a week or vice versa. So we found that there has been this broadening, and even in dialogue, as you've highlighted with your fieldwork, Michelle, is that it is possible to access more broadly. And I think sometimes before the pandemic, it's easy to get a bit lazy and assume that if people want to engage, they will travel. And that's pretty prohibitive from an expense perspective for people with disability, caring responsibilities. So that is also something that has shifted. And I think the gender dimension, and if we're taking a focus on human security in our region, gender participation is really important. And we need to make sure everyone's coming to the table. And this is something that ASEAN want to talk about, is gender, peace and security.
Richard, I want to return to this question of human security and push you and Huang, who maybe don't think about it quite as much as you think about some of the hard stuff sometimes. What, in your perspective, are the key human security issues for the region?
Well, I mentioned health security. I really do think health security is going to remain an incredibly important issue for Southeast Asian countries. And one thing, I think one bitter lesson that they've drawn from the pandemic is that they can't rely on anyone else to help them quickly when they need it. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the story on vaccines in Southeast Asia, where, well, across the globe really, where wealthy countries bought up many more vaccines than they actually needed. And when developing countries, including those in Southeast Asia, wanted to get their hands on vaccines, they really couldn't, and they couldn't make them quickly inside Southeast Asia. Of course, it was the Chinese that arrived first with vaccines, both for sale and donation. And America didn't follow until, well, almost until it was too late. Vaccine security was an issue for Southeast Asia even before the pandemic, but now I think it's going to be an even bigger one. And I do think there are opportunities for Australia to keep working. We have a good record on working with the region on health security. We do have a fledgling mRNA tech sector, which is not just about vaccines, but all sorts of applications for mRNA. So we can be a good player on health security. You mentioned biosecurity. Absolutely, that's going to be a two-way partnership for a long time. I think quick observation on human security, because I want to say something quickly about education, is it's interesting that that terrorism, which used to be the big cross-border transnational security issue, is now a much less prominent part of Australia's engagement with Southeast Asia. Now, the foundations are still there. The working relations between police agencies and security agencies are still very strong. There's still a small but very persistent strain of violent Islamists in Southeast Asia. But it is interesting, I think, that this is not now perhaps the prominent part of relations between Australia and Southeast Asia.
I'd like to jump in there for a minute, Richard, just before you move on. You talked about the opportunities that biosecurity brings Australia. What about the imperatives that it brings? I mean, I think the average Australian has a much better understanding now of the fact that even though we are an island, we can't avoid these things. Do you think there are, really concrete imperatives that will push new ways of engaging on these sorts of questions in the region?
Well, the obvious one right now, because it's been playing out, is foot and mouth. Yeah. Now the concern seems to have eased a little bit because it looks like the Indonesians are getting hold of the outbreak. But of course, the warnings about the dire consequences for Australian livestock industry are, they have to be listened to. We've seen how it's devastated livestock industries in other countries, including the United Kingdom. And the only way that we can fight against that is through partnerships, right? We have to work with Southeast Asia. We have to give them the capacity where we can to help them to build up the technical capacity, the skills they need, the tools they need to deal with these outbreaks. And so that's the idea of genuine partnership.
And again, before you move on to education, Pong, I want to get you to respond to my questions about human security first.
So two things in top of my mind. I'm not sure if cybersecurity counts. I think it is considered a non-traditional new emerging threat, but it's more like robot security these days. You have to prove if you are a human on all kind of engagement. But I would like to link it to the previous discussion about the rapid digitalization, because yes, it is a huge embrace in the region across all countries, especially post-pandemic, but that also introduced a lot of risks that people are not necessarily, everyone is well prepared for. And we also hear all kinds of scams and cyber crimes happening online now, but as well as another risk of creating another group that is left behind, those that are not digitally literate. So I think that's where Australia can really help, because there are countries in the region that are very, very advanced with AI and fintechs such as Singapore, but there are also countries or certain areas in certain countries, because the development is very uneven, and there is a clear divide between urban and rural areas in the larger countries in the region, where that basic technological education is not well delivered to everyone. So yes, we've moved on to, for example, online learning and education, or even doing business during the pandemic, but not everyone was equipped to do that, and we have a lot of a big group of people left behind. I think the main urban and young population will be doing great and actually surpassing perhaps Australia's innovation in many aspects, but there are also a number of small and medium businesses, all from the different demographics, that are suffering with that, not catching up with that technological challenge, and cybersecurity being one of them, very obvious. But that leads me to another point that is also linked to technology, which I made in my opening remark, and that technology transformation is in energy and climate adaptation. And Southeast Asia, as we all know, is one of the most vulnerable and most affected regions to climate changes, and not every country have policies and plans for adaptation in place. In fact, they are heavily reliant often on external aid and development and programs, because they are very costly, and there's a need of technological expertise and trainings as well. And for example, just in Vietnam, if the climate adaptation is not done well, by 2050, it's going to cost the country up to 15% of GDP. So it's not just going to be a non-traditional or human security. It's going to affect millions of people that might be displaced because of that. And that's just Vietnam. And the rest of the region is also very prone to more and more disasters coming from the climate change. So I think those two key areas, but they can all link to the technological development and transformation done well.
Yeah, and Richard, of course, in your remarks, you also highlighted the opportunities for Australia in engaging with green technology and an attempt to get the energy problem under control. I just want to return to the digital divide for a minute, because of course, even traditional literacy in the region is still patchy. You've got countries like Indonesia where it's very high. You go to somewhere like Cambodia and it's much, much lower. It's interesting though, I always think about Indonesia as a sort of reading, having skipped the reading stage, Indonesia going from an oral culture to a digital culture through the introduction of digital media. And I wonder if we'll see more of that in other parts of the world, of the region. The other thing I wanted to raise just on the security issue before we move on is growing nationalism, resource nationalism. I mean, Indonesia is a key case, but it's not just Indonesia. Issues like the material transfer agreements, attempt to claw back some sovereignty when it comes to the sorts of both plant-based, but also even human specimens. We have a colleague, Sonia van Bisselen, who works on the biosecurity aspects, the legal and social aspects of biosecurity. It's fascinating, the depth of the debate in Indonesia and elsewhere. And in fact, Indonesia is a world leader in some ways in this attempt to fence off its very rich resources biologically from the rest of the world and to exert control. This is an area where Australia is quite exposed, I think, as a country where many researchers engage with Indonesia. There's potential for this elsewhere in the region as well. How do we, and this is, Susanna, I might come back to you on this, how do we manage those education and research relationships in such a way that we respect countries' right to control their bio and other assets, but at the same time make room for foreign researchers, either from elsewhere in ASEAN, but also from Australia, in ways that really do promote solutions to some of the emerging biosecurity and other challenges we face?
I'm not sure I can speak in too much detail on the question that you've raised about that question about sort of access for Australian researchers into the region. I mean, I would certainly agree that I think it's, you know, very, very important that we do have those kind of reciprocal ties, you know, and I'm aware that there are issues with Australians getting visas to do really important research in Indonesia and elsewhere, but I probably can't speak in terms of the sort of the solutions to that, I'm afraid.
I'll put you on notice for the next time we meet. So now that we've circled back to education, Richard, you wanted to make some comments on our earlier discussion?
Thank you, Michelle. One quick point. As I invariably do, I totally agree with Susanna that a significant component of education in Australia is essential for our Southeast Asian links. But of course, Southeast Asians have more opportunity to go elsewhere, more choices these days. And there are a couple of things that we have to do other than help with the financing of these scholarships that are important. One is sustain the quality of the degrees that Southeast Asians come for, because they can now and do go to top universities around the world. So the quality of our degrees have to stack up. And then the second thing is really important, the quality of the time they have here. So we have to make sure while they're here, they're safe, they're healthy, and they're happy. And we do have good experience at working hard at that. But that second aspect of making their education here a positive experience is just so critical.
And that brings us nicely back to Josephine's third theme, which of course was youth. Outside the education system, Josephine, what can Australia do better in its attempt to engage with Southeast Asian youth?
All right. I think beyond the educations, that I just want to make a little remarks about educations, that most of the times that the country engaging the Southeast Asia or Indonesia in particular, we just focus more on the higher education, which I think the most of the problem that is happening currently in the region is on the primary educations, like the early childhood. So I think I engage with like some of the teachers, not only in Indonesia, but mostly in Vietnam, Myanmar, Cambodia. And most of them feels that, of course, that we have to focus on the higher educations because they are ready to be the workforce. But I think how the country building the foundations for the children to get a better educations, that could also be opportunity for Australian government to engage. Because I think Australia, when I see that, I think the education on the early childhood, they have a great one. So that kind of an exchange of knowledge would be a great one, starting from the schools or even teacher. But I think beyond the educations that needs to be taken into consideration is as well as I think the sustainability issue, that I think on the not only green economy but mostly on the sustainability, because I think now that most of ASEAN countries tries to some sort of moving toward a more sustainable, like in any food or supply chain or any something that is consumer goods. So I think by being together in the same table, that from ASEAN and Australia, we can some sort of how do we some sort of tackle the issue of plastics, and then how do we build a more sustainable product. So I think that does not require a lot of resources in terms of like funding or money, but just like how can we some sort of build a roadmap that is an actionable item in terms of that I think both work in business and also both work in academia and then also the university. So I think that's the other key opportunities for Australia to look at in terms of digital economy.
And thanks for that. We've got two more questions before we open up to the floor. And please, if you are in the audience, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function and we'll turn to those shortly. So my second last question bounces off another point that Tamerlane raised, which was that bilateral engagement is not enough. Hong, can we start with you? If bilateral engagement is not enough, and I assume you agree with that premise, how do we engage in other ways that are meaningful and not just a diplomatic talk fest?
It's an ongoing question, right? I think Australia has a very strong framework to engage regionally, with ASEAN being the longest and strategic partner, in fact, in many aspects. And I think it's not just about kind of official language reiterating the ASEAN centrality, but I think largely the policymakers do actually mean that when they say that, at least most of the time, I would hope, and judging from the activities and programs in the region. And in fact, all of Australian bilateral relations with the Southeast Asian countries have always linked in one way or another to the broader regional significance. So it's trying to make it as an integral part of the larger regional engagement. So I don't see it necessarily as separate. But having said that, I think the bilateral relationships are very important in a way that they can be tailored to the specific needs of the countries, as mentioned by me and everyone in the panel. The region is very, very, very diverse. So there will be different needs for different countries. And so there are different kind of programs that would matter more, depending on the dialogue partner that we're talking about. For example, and I would say oftentimes they are quite sophisticated. The Australia's program in Southeast Asia, they might not be as large scale, like let's say China does, or any other major countries, or those that are doing better job in PR. But Australians' development programs are quite sophisticated in terms of that, especially and adapted to the new needs with, for example, programs in cooperation with CSIRO on technology and agri-tech, things that are quite new and in a large demand in Southeast Asia, maybe not necessarily in Singapore, but in Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, they would, or Indonesia, they would be. The new programs like Australia for Innovation and Skills, those are ones that are geared towards the new areas of technology and innovation. I think, the complex picture of that means that it is well thought through. The question is only, the scope and I think effect of them. And I think this is a good opportunity for the new government to rethink some of that as the Australia Development Cooperation Program towards Southeast Asia is end of this year. I think it provides a great opportunity for the new government to rethink that program and relocate the resources. And I think if that was to make bigger impact, it's now the time to redesign it.
Okay, thanks very much. I like to keep to time, so I'll save my last question for our wrap up, and we'll turn to the audience questions now. We've got a bunch already, but if other people have some, please add them to the Q&A function. The first one's from Tom Barber, who wants to ask the panelists how the change in government in Canberra has been received in Southeast Asia, and whether you think there is a prospect for a genuine step up in engagement. First to in, best served, who would like to start? Caroline, why don't you, I'm sure you have an opinion on this, why don't you tell us what it is?
I think I mean, there has also been the advantage of borders opening, which makes it a little easier, but being in the region has been so positively received. And I think Penny Wong, by nature of her, even just her cultural heritage, as well as her style, has really demonstrated, her use at speaking Bahasa in Indonesia and then speaking Malay in Malaysia is just showing a different level of sophistication of engagement, I think, and the demonstration of commitment to ASEAN in terms of prioritising where we go first. I think that's been really well received, and obviously everyone will wait to make sure it's long term. And I think that's one of the things that I'd really like to emphasize in terms of advice is that it needs to be long-term relationship focused, whatever we do. Having been involved in this space for decades, you see a lot of initiatives that start and stop and start and stop, and you can't turn on and off a relationship. And I think we are in ASEAN, we're a dialogue partner, we've been recognised as that, and we need to commit and continue to engage. So this shouldn't just be a one-off initiative. This is continuing, collaborating, partnering, and being sophisticated about our approach into the future. So I think that has been appreciated, that willingness to partner. Thanks for that.
Huang, I'm going to turn to you and ask you the second part of Tom's question, which Tamerlane's set up very nicely. Tom says, to play devil's advocate, if Australia's current interest is due primarily to geopolitical competition, then won't it just fade again? How do we ensure that the region is seen as being important in its own right?
I think, I agree with Tamarine, and I think it's been very well received that the government with Prime Minister and Foreign Minister have been paying visits to the region and making right announcement in very early weeks. I think that has been very well received. But I do think there is also an element that there will be higher expectation from this government, especially from Penny Wong, than from the previous government. I think there is a sense of pride in the region that there is someone with the heritage from Southeast Asia and understanding the region. So I think there would be a lot of expectation coming forward. So it's a key to stand up to those expectations in the long term. The second, I do think there are a few question marks, maybe not necessarily tension, but question mark. One of them that Tom highlighted about the geopolitics. So one way to go about it, and I think Foreign Minister Wong has been quite clear about that, is the right messaging and more sensitivity in putting out Australian narrative and also explaining certain Australian choices, even though they stand quite starkly different from the region. But at least I think she might be better in articulating the reasons behind them. Two questions from the region that often pop up is one is the human rights issues going to be an issue in some bilateral relations, a source of tension, including for example, from Vietnam, or the question of Myanmar, because Australia, with a value-based foreign policy, probably is expected to have some responses and sense towards the situation in Myanmar right now, but at the same time, that could put another become another source of tension, not only with Myanmar, but also others, ASEAN neighbours and ASEAN as itself. So there are, of course, this will depend on the development of Myanmar and Myanmar's relationship within ASEAN itself as well. But there are, of course, a number of challenges out there as well, aside from very positive early reactions to this government.
Since you've mentioned Myanmar, I'm going to jump down the list a bit. Don't worry if your question came earlier, I'll get back to it. But Joyce Fu asks about refugee and asylum seekers moving between ASEAN and Australia, including the Rohingya from Myanmar, but also Tamil from Sri Lanka and from refugees from further afield. Since 2014, she says, Australia's banned any refugee resettlement from Indonesia, and there's about 14,000 refugees who don't have rights to education, healthcare, work, and other basic rights. And there's daily protests on the streets in Indonesia about this. So she's talking about refugees caught in Indonesia rather than ones who've made it to Australia. I mean, this is clearly one of those human security issues that we were talking about. Richard, do you want to tackle that one for us?
Oh, you've given me the hardest one of all. Yeah, this is exceptionally hard and difficult at many levels, including, of course, the human level. So I think any Australian government is going to be nervous about beginning to take refugees out of that pool in America, simply because of the history where, at its height, we were getting arrivals from Indonesia to Christmas Island, mostly at an annualized rate of about 60,000 a year, and no sign of that graph going down soon. So we were actually entering into an unplanned experiment in Australian migration and social cohesion. So no Australian government wants to go there again. If we hadn't seen the uptick from Sri Lanka recently, I might have said that the time could actually become where Australia could start taking quietly and carefully people itself from that pool. After all, we have done so quietly and carefully from Nauru to try and end that ghastly running sore. There are other things we can do. We can try and help Indonesia and the relevant UN agencies to find homes for these people in other countries. There's an advocacy role to help Indonesia, and we can also help Indonesia support these individuals in country. Many of them are stuck in limbo, have got their lives on hold, have done for a very long time, exceptionally economically insecure, and also often living in conditions where their own personal security is vulnerable. So anything we can do to help that on a bilateral basis would be useful.
Thanks. And Susanna, Joel's asked a question about education opportunities for people in Myanmar, where he was teaching recently. And he observes that there are many students there capable of contributing more of their own funds. So perhaps some partial scholarship as a teaser would be a possibility as a model of getting more people of, and I mean, Richard referenced the growing consumer class in the region in his opening remarks, but for people in countries like Myanmar who have resources, may be very capable students, are there ways of attracting them to Australia, both as a part of the education system, but also as a contribution to the process of democratisation, he asks?
I mean, I think I've already spoken a bit about sort of the education and you know, I think it's very important that Australia does what it can in all respects to ensure that it remains an attractive destination for students from Southeast Asia. But I think I might just say something more on Myanmar generally, if that's okay, because I think, you know, that's a really important topic that a lot of people will be asking about in the context of a discussion about ASEAN.
And just before you go on to that, I'll give you another question that's been asked about that, so you can focus your response. And that's the question of authoritarian regimes in ASEAN versus democracy. And this anonymous questioner asks about, well, says that the Myanmar dictatorship destroys ASEAN's dignity, unity, and reputation. So if you could maybe build that into your, a reflection on that into your response.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Australia's always really navigated a kind of middle path between engagement and criticism of regional human rights situations. And we've done that, I think, fairly successfully over many years, thinking about other regimes in the region where there have been serious human rights concerns, like Cambodia and Thailand. But I think Myanmar, it just has to be acknowledged, is just on a different scale. And I mean, it has been for some time, given the atrocities that were perpetuated against the Rohingya minority as well. So I think Australia and other external partners to ASEAN have been fortunate in the sense that ASEAN also has taken a much stronger approach on Myanmar than it has on other human rights situations in the region. And although ASEAN often gets criticised for not having done enough, it has taken the unprecedented step of preventing Myanmar from sending political level representatives to ASEAN meetings. So that's really important. And I think now we're starting to see another shift following the execution of the political activists in Myanmar, where ASEAN itself, but also other external partners, are now considering what further steps they can take to both to isolate the current regime in Neighbours, but also to support the opposition movement in Myanmar. And there's no easy solutions here because I think regardless of what the international community does, Myanmar is already in the midst of a very long-running and bloody civil war. But certainly I think Australia and the new government are and should be looking at what more we can do by way of sanctions and potentially also support for the opposition movement.
Thanks very much for that. We're going to turn to a couple of responses to my questions on the sovereignty over natural resources and research processes. And David Guest, who's also at the University of Sydney, rightly observes that it's important to avoid helicopter research and ensure that our research partnerships do add value and capacity. Keeping that in mind, Haswani Sungip has asked, how do we ensure fair and diverse representation when navigating research? Josephine, can I get you to reflect on that?
All right. I think the questions coming from David in terms of like diverse participation in terms of research, I think both like Australia and Indonesia would be very important, because now that some of the research project that I used to be a part of, like I did research as well, and some sort of like the terms of reference sometimes not really take into considerations like what would be some sort of like a deal breaker in the future. And I think that has become the problem. And also in terms of the representations, it's sometimes not really inclusive, because I think I read some of the terms of reference and maybe they just not really include like women at some point, the portions in that sense. But I think the Australian government, I think starting in like 2021, in the earlier when I check, it's just like they start to like include more women participations and some of like with disabilities, because I think that kind of a mutual understanding that we have to be very inclusive in terms of research and the participations, that's a great stuff. But I think in terms of like because I think like when I try to like understand the research project that made by Australia and then like maybe other countries, it's sometimes not really disclosed like what would be like the long-term things. And sometimes that kind of see when we see like, oh, this has become a problem in the mid of the. So I think that kind of thing should some sort of understand how the Indonesians, especially when you some sort of get a data or get something that is a bit sensitive, confidential. I think some sort of a preventive measure should be taken when you want to have a smooth research project or in any kind of sense. So I think that's my take on that.
Haswani in his question, their question, raises not only research, but also fair and representation in advocacy and campaign issues, and not just in Indonesia, but in developing countries in Southeast Asia more generally. I mean, again, this is an interesting one. One of the things that Sydney Southeast Asia Centre has done is do Australian government funded training for women NGO activists and disability activists. And for me, this is a really fantastic initiative from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade that recognises that Australia's responsibility is not just to engage with bureaucrats and business people, as most of its short courses do, but in fact with activists. And of course, they've funded other activist programs throughout the region along these same lines. So this question of advocacy and campaigning, and some people before, I think one that might have been you, talked about to what extent human rights come to dominate Australia's discussion with the region and the risk of that, particularly with the situation in Myanmar. What role do we have as Australians from Asian backgrounds, as Australians with Southeast Asian links? What role do we have to engage in advocacy and campaigning? And to Haswani's point, how do we ensure fair and diverse representation within that? And I think this is a great question when we're thinking about the finger wagging or deputy sheriff kind of model that is often used to describe Australia's engagement on these issues. Who would like to take that? Okay, Tamalia?
Can I just take a little piece of it? And I think we do need to be aware that there is a very complex post-colonial environment in many countries in Southeast Asia. And so there is a line between going and telling people what they should be doing in a context with very complex histories, and independence wasn't that long ago, and advocating. And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't advocate, but we need to be very respectful of the context we're going into, and also recognising that we don't have everything right in Australia. And I think this is where Foreign Minister Wong's conversations around Indigenous and First Nations foreign policy are really interesting. And I think the conversation in Australia around our history is becoming more nuanced and starting to be slightly more sophisticated. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays itself out in terms of our foreign policy in the region. So I'd just say that we have to be respectful and aware of the context, and also advocacy without understanding local languages and cultures can also be very lacking nuance, basically. So it's important to respect and recognise what is going on locally and be aware of your position, privilege, power in that context. But also, it's not to say that we shouldn't have conversations about difficult issues. And I would argue that this is one of the things that Australia really brings as a dialogue partner, is that I think Australia is good at convening conversations that matter. And that's something that we can do and we need to do and we need to invest in. And when I say dialogue, it's listening as well as speaking. And so bringing together people who have a shared interest in issues, not necessarily who agree, however. It's very easy to hear the same opinions over and over and over again in certain conversations around ASEAN engagement. How do we broaden that out so that we actually have a diversity of perspectives and opinions? May not always be comfortable, but it's going to be a more rigorous conversation. It's going to lead to more innovation. Maybe a little uncomfortable, but we need to go there and we need to be willing to sit with that discomfort. Because if we only want to have conversations with people who agree with us or tell people who don't agree with us why they're wrong, we're not going to be a very welcome dialogue partner in the long term. So I think there's
and of course that is an issue that the whole world is facing, isn't it? That need to have conversations across with people with whom we don't agree, as well as those with whom we agree. And of course, an important resource in those sorts of conversations is the diaspora in Australia, the Southeast Asian diaspora. And an anonymous attendee wants to know if panelists have thoughts on how we could better engage with the Southeast Asia diaspora in Australia to build ties with ASEAN countries. And Huang, I'd like you to address that one, please.
Oh, yeah, I just realized I'm one of the diaspora, perhaps.
Yes.
I think both the previous and this questions, I think, all speak to the strength of civil society and that people-to-people connection. And I think from my experience, Australia and Australians who have done work that you would maybe classify as advocacy and campaign are doing pretty good job. I think there's a great deal of sensitivity across all Southeast Asian countries, depending on the subject. And if you just brand it as human rights and politicize that, I think in general, that would be quite a sensitive area to go in. But there are a number of areas where Australia can bring up and strengthen that civil society. And often it is related to, for example, I think these days are very popular, like environmental rights, the environmentalist movement, LGBTQ movement, especially very receptive in young people, perhaps more so in the secular countries, right? But work on gender equality and gender mainstreaming, I think it's also very well received. And oftentimes it is initiated or partnered with the government initiative, but oftentimes you see also the diaspora, young people growing up in Australia, coming back and bringing that energy and activism back to their home countries or home region, I would say. I think I see that a lot happening with the Vietnamese Australian community, other than I think business-oriented, business-focused community. There's a lot of entrepreneurship on the social agenda, social entrepreneurship, and often those relate to environment or gender or others. And I think that's a great connection. That's a great resource. It's another way of education, not necessarily formal education with diploma, but also bringing those training opportunities to the youth, especially youth in the region, which is very receptive of this kind of activities and initiatives. So I think that's combining, I think it came naturally from engagement of the diaspora with the government. I think there are few that have recognized and utilized that strength, that Vietnam, Australia Young Leadership Dialogue, for example, being one example, or ASEAN young leaders as well. But yeah, I think from the beginning, it's mostly individuals from the diaspora that bring that initiative forward.
It's interesting, this question of influence, and another of our questioners has asked specifically about influence on legal frameworks within ASEAN. And I mean, of course, this is an area where there's been a lot of influence from abroad, particularly in countries that have gone through a major political change, thinking about Cambodia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Myanmar in 2011. We can see the imprint of many different international bodies and countries on law. In my area of research, the International Labour Organization had this kind of cookie cutter approach to labour law that is remarkably evident in the countries I've just mentioned. But more broadly, is anyone in a position to comment on Australia's influence on legal frameworks in ASEAN? Okay, we might have to let that one go through to the keeper, but it was a great question, so I really wanted to acknowledge it. Richard, before we were talking about digital technology, and we've got a question here about digital communication, but a specific one about the content of communication rather than necessarily its medium. And the anonymous attendee refers to Radio Australia, which of course transmitted through the region for many decades, but now is maybe not so evident. Do you have any thoughts on what sort of soft power rather than technological aspects of digital communication Australian policymakers should be thinking about at this time?
That is a pretty interesting question for a couple of reasons. One is the way in which Southeast Asia gets its news and communicates these days. So like many parts of the world, most Southeast Asians get their news on their phone, on Facebook, or on another social media platform. There's also an awful lot of Chinese language or Chinese sourced media in Southeast Asia. It's content that's often provided free to digital news platforms in Southeast Asia that are hungry for cheap content because it's hard to make a living in media in Southeast Asia. And then when you layer that on top of a very a generation of Southeast Asians that love a good rumour, you do get a very interesting information environment, and one in which Australia, through traditional media, often finds it almost impossible to have any impact at all, or to be heard. And it's quite difficult to know what to do about that. You know, I don't think Radio Australia is the answer. You know, it's just not going to get listened to. And I don't think that ambassadors being on Twitter is the answer either. You know, there's just a limited amount of reach that you can do there. But I do think, and this is a point that some people actually in Canberra in the Foreign Ministry have actually made to me, and I know that they've thought about that, we do need to have people in foreign ministries and in bits of government that are much more focused on the idea of strategic communications, especially in Southeast Asia. And if you do have a policy proposition that you want to sell, like you shouldn't worry too much about our 8 nuclear-powered submarines whenever they arrive, then you've got to be very nimble, agile, and modern in the way you convey your messages into Southeast Asia and get them amplified by others. And at the moment, we're not doing that.
Now, Susanna, that same questioner asks, do universities have the capacity to broadcast as a means of exchanging ideas, education, and opinions?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe could I just touch on the sort of the question around media, because I do think that that's a really important one. I think one area where Australia and other countries can have a role is in terms of supporting independent media in Southeast Asia, and I think that can have its own sensitivities if foreigners are seen to be supporting domestic media there. But I think there are ways, you know, depending on the country context, where it can be done very successfully. And it's hugely important because, as Richard said, you know, there are situations where sort of narratives that are very sort of quite adverse to Australia's interests take root very quickly, and there's very little ability for that to be corrected. So I think that's really important. But it also, you know, maybe to sort of just link back to some of the earlier discussion, I think this question about how much Australia should focus on civil society and on organisations outside government versus how much our engagement should be directed to working with governments. And this is particularly the case when we're talking about our development assistance, is a really important one, because you have some very different models in Southeast Asia. You know, you have the US, which pretty much works almost exclusively with civil society and delivering aid its own way, kind of working around regional governments rather than with them. China, which has very little ability to engage with civil society at all. And I think Australia does mostly working with government, but also with a kind of dollop of civil society engagement on the side. And I think that's probably about the right mix for us, but it is an important one to think about because it does go to some broader questions about the role of values and democracy in our foreign policy, like we were talking about earlier.
Just before we're out of time for the Q&A, but I want to wrap up with a combination of 3 other questions. And my apologies to people who ask questions that we haven't addressed. There are 3 people who have really gone back to that big picture international relations question and asked about Australia's role as a stabiliser with regional challenges like the South China Sea issue, thinking about security and defence cooperation. But I think most interestingly, Atitaya asks, as we decolonise our approach to international relations and integrate or see ourselves as part of the region as opposed to separate to it, will our threat perception of China change? Huang and Richard, you're in the hot seat for this one, but very brief answers because we are rapidly running out of time.
You go
Huang,
first.
I'll go. Yeah, go on. Huang, you start, and Richard can wrap up.
Yes, I'm trying to decode the premise of decolonizing approach to IR. I think that's a sort of separate discussion, and I'm not sure if I'm seeing that happening especially in the current policy context. But I think depending who you ask, I presume it's Australia, that perception of China. I think we are currently on certain path that it's hard to change in the foreseeable future. I think both public opinion and decision makers' opinion are quite set by now, and even with the change of a government, I think the main core of the view of China is not changing. And that also is both ways, because China's approach hasn't changed. And I think even though Labour might tend to be maybe more diplomatic and more measured in response, I think the positions and views are basically the same. It's just hopefully a better way of articulation of them.
And Richard?
Yeah, I agree with Huang. The short answer to the question is no. And I think, look, it's not impossible that Australia's approach to China or relationship with China will change into the future. We should never be fatalistic or deterministic about the possibility of something better than we have now. But if it does change in the future, it won't, I don't think, be because of our engagement in Southeast Asia. It will be because the United States and close partners like Australia have managed to pull off the impossible trick, which we'd like to pull off, but which is proving really, really hard to do, which is to find some way of coexisting with China in which the competition between the great powers and China and the rest of us is managed, and there is some room for doing things of mutual benefit together. That kind of lowers the temperature all round. That's how it might change.
Okay, thanks for that. As Huang said, I think the very big question of decolonisation of international relations is probably the topic for a whole seminar by itself. So just to finish off, I'm going to ask each of our panellists to give a brief prediction. And the prediction I want them to give is, in 3 years' time, when the first term of the new government is over, how do you think you're going to feel about Australia's relationship with ASEAN? And Richard, we'll start off with you.
3 years is an eternity, so the honest answer is I don't know. No, more seriously, I think it'll be pretty good. Look, and one reason I'm going to say that is perhaps someone from Canberra would say this, but our relations with Southeast Asia were on the whole not that bad before the election. You know, it's a bit of a myth that our relations were terrible before the election and now they're wonderful after. Successive Australian governments have had their ups and downs with Southeast Asia. We've had some rough patches, but successive Australian governments from both sides of politics have seen the importance of the region to Australia and have wanted to invest in it. Now, I think with the new government, we've got a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm. We've got a positive narrative. We've got a government that wants to present the modern face of Australia. With a bit of luck, despite our terrible, terrible budget circumstances that the Treasurer keeps warning us about, there will be a little bit more money so we can keep increasing development assistance and some more money for some positive new initiatives in the region. And if we can do all that and manage down the inevitable differences, manage those tensions in the relationships that we've sometimes experienced, then we'll be doing well. And, you know, to go back to Tom Barber's question, we do actually have our own direct interest in strong, healthy, productive relations with Southeast Asia, independent of either China or America. They're really important to us.
Okay, thank you. And the former diplomat's answer that definitely was. Anyone going to take a sharper go at my question? Anyone got a different kind of prediction or a more specific prediction about what we might see at the end of the term? Susanna, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention something specifically about ASEAN as opposed to Southeast Asia as a whole, which is just note that 2024 is the 50th anniversary of Australia-ASEAN relations. So I hope that that will be a time when, you know, it will be recognised that Australia actually already has a terrifically successful relationship with ASEAN, the institution. We are, you know, I wouldn't be too sort of boastful about our position as a partner for Southeast Asia as a whole, but with ASEAN, the institution, we do a great job. So I really hope that in 2024, we'll see the ASEAN leaders coming out to Australia for a commemorative summit, and that it will be, you know, another really important opportunity for Australia to cement those political relationships.
Okay, thanks for that. Tamerlane, do you want to weigh in?
I like Susanna's idea. I hadn't thought of that, but that would be nice to see. I think I agree. The Australia-ASEAN relationship has been really strong as an institution, and, you know, the Australia-ASEAN summit, when Australia hosted as a dialogue partner, was extraordinary. I think hopefully we double down on what works. I think there's a lot that does work. It's very easy to focus on the negatives. There's a lot of very strong people-to-people relationships, particularly off the back of a long time of educational exchange. And despite all the conversation around digital, we still need to do face-to-face. And I think our universities have really suffered in the last couple of years. And I hope they can get back to at least to where they were, so that students can come back and engage. Like, we really do need that. Educational links are really, really important. So I really hope in 3 years we can say that students from the region are back, they're thriving, but we're expanding and doubling down a lot of that breadth in terms of digital engagement, inclusive participatory engagement with ASEAN. I'd like to see more engagement on gender, peace and security. So I think if we keep going on the trajectory we're on, in terms of Australia, ASEAN particularly as an institution, we're on a good track. Thank you.
Josephine, what do you think from your place in Jakarta? What is your prediction for how you're going to feel at the end of this term?
I think it's a bit of mixed feelings because I'm not really sure about it, but I think I think the next year, Indonesia would be the next chairman of ASEAN. And I think Australia, with that visit and the monumental photo with the President Jokowi, I think if they can some sort of leverage Indonesian chairmanship to not only strengthen it, but really to reach, of course, the other part of ASEAN, like the CLMV countries. I think that would be a great relationship in the next 3 years. because I think most of when people see like ASEAN engagement, it's just like mostly like the 5 big countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Thailand, Philippines. But sometimes we forget that the CLMP region exists. But when we can actually have a holistic approach to like engaging with like the 10 members of ASEAN, that would be not only strong enough, but ASEAN would feel that, oh, Australia is not being partial, and they would really play the role as a stabilizers because they don't pick sides and they just like really help all of the 10 members of ASEAN thrive in the next 3 years.
I mean, two things on that though. To be fair, Australia does invest a lot in the Mekong region, and I think its presence is quite well felt there. And my other observation with regard to your opening remark, when I was in Indonesia in 1991, it was really remarkable how many private houses had pictures of Paul and Anita Keating in them. And, you know, that personal engagement that is really important if it's done in the right way. But Huang, I don't want to take away, we're over time, but you can bring us out with your last minute and your prediction as an Asian Australian.
Look, all the panelists have already highlighted the points that I agree with, and in general, I'm quite optimistic in the next 3 years as well. And to be honest, I think there is always there is more that Australia can do. There is always going to be that. I think it was helpful that we sort of identified key areas where I hope to see more progress in the next 3 years, as you mentioned, be them education, public health, digital transformation and technology, and all those areas are key, and I hope the new government will focus more on. But my benchmark would be also that in next 3 years, the government is able to bring back more interest in Southeast Asia to Australia, in education here, in terms of language, but also general history, other areas that are not necessarily that prevalent in the curriculum, but also to the mainstream debate and discussion. Right now, it's very rare that you see coverage or in-depth coverage of Southeast Asia. Is still very much seldom and fragmented compared to, for example, coverage that you see in Japan or Korea or other neighbors. So I hope one of the benchmark would be bringing back or increase the interest in Southeast Asia within Australia.
Well, I think we should reconvene this panel in 3 years' time and see how you all did with your predictions. But in the meantime, thank you so much for coming, and thanks to our audience. I hope you enjoyed that session as much as I did, and we hope to see you at another SEAC event soon. Thanks a lot, everyone.